Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Lieberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 138 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. This is Melisa Lieberman, and I'm excited for you to be here today with me for this topic. I cannot wait to share it with you. I had started out today with a completely different topic, and this evolved, and I love just going with the flow. So I will share with you the originally planned topic next week. So that's a bit of a cliffhanger. And today we're going to talk about what are you willing to do to be successful in your consulting business. I'm excited to share with you how this has evolved because it actually started with one of my son's swimming event last weekend and has evolved into an entire episode. So I'm excited to share with you this inspiration and how it applies to your consulting business. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'll get to it here in a second. Also, wanted to share with you, just on a personal note, my book proposal was approved. And so the next step is to write the book. I've got all of the outline done. I know exactly what everything is and the chapters. And so now I've got to sit down and write it. And so my editor, my publisher, she's kind of a combination indie a hybrid publisher and coach. I guess I'll call her that. She's everything all wrapped in one. Amazing. Anyway, she recommended just going away and writing the book in, she said 3 days. It's going to take me about 3.5 days based on the schedule that I created. So I did that. I booked a hotel, going to go write the book. She said, do a really terrible first draft. And so that's what the goal is. I know you're not one to go do terrible work. I definitely am not one either. So it's kind of pushing me out of my boundaries. But obviously, that's not what we're going to publish. It's just a way to get all of the ideas out on paper that I've already, outlined. And then we're going to start the intensive editing process from there. So this is coming together really quickly. And the book will be released. I'm going to tell you the date. I'm looking at it in my calendar right now on January 25th. Can you believe that? I started this, I believe, in September, and it will be out in January. So, a really amazing process. So, when you decide to do something, go do it. Make it happen. You can do it, even if it feels like a big mountain to climb. Okay, that is not the topic of today's podcast, though. I was just sharing with you that personal note, and now we'll move on to the agenda for today. Today, we're going to talk about what are you willing to do to be successful? And I'm going to share with you 3 types of willingness and stories from other consultants. And the swim story I want to share with you too that kind of inspired this episode and bring together this idea of what are you willing to do to be successful through those 3 types and the stories around them. And then we'll wrap up today's episode with 5 questions that you can leverage for yourself to put today's topic into practice. So you can make this a tangible, implementable, actionable concept in your business. So with that, we're going to just dive right in. And the first type of willingness. So what are you willing to do to be successful in your consulting business? The first type of willingness is what are you willing to try? So many consultants that I talk to are worried about picking the right method, picking the right lead generation method, picking the right specialization, picking the right niche, picking the right offer, picking the right ideal client profile, whatever it is. We want to get things right. And so then we end up in this analysis paralysis situation where we aren't even willing to, either not willing or we're dipping our toe into the next step. And so today, the first thing that I want to share with you in this concept of what are you willing to do to be successful, the first type of willingness is what are you willing to try? And that is a verb, right? To try, not to And we'll use another word too. What are you willing to experiment with? That is a verb and action versus willing to think about in a lab before going out and doing it safely, right? So let me just tell you this story. This is the inspiration of today's episode. What are you willing to try? My youngest son, who is 8, he figured out somewhere along the way, the last month or so, he figured out that our swim team did not have any record. So our swim team is 25 years old. The club that my 3 boys swim for is 25 years old. They have all these different records for all these different age groups, and they're separated by girls and boys. They're all based on length of swim and that kind of thing. And he realized his brother, the oldest, has 2 of these swim records. And so it's kind of been on the youngest son's mind. I want one of these also. And so he figured out that there was no record for the age group 8 and under boys, 500 free. So that is a freestyle event where you swim 20 lengths of the pool. And it takes, I did a little bit of Googling. It can take anywhere from 5 minutes, which is the national record for 10 and under. There, I don't even think there's an 8 and under record. I could be wrong. But anyway, plus or minus 5 minutes for this like national record, all the way to honestly so many kids who can't even finish this, and adults. I'm sure if I tried it, I probably wouldn't finish it. Generally speaking, it's like a 10-minute for his age group, maybe 10 or even 20 minutes to finish this. Sorry, not 10. It's somewhere around 15 or 20 minutes to finish this race if they can even finish it. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context here. So anyway, he figures out that there's this record or this missing record, this opportunity. No one has ever done this before in 25 years. And so he registers for it. We have an event, a swim meet, and you go into this app and you check off the events you want to swim, and it goes to your coach for approval. His coach pressed decline, cannot swim this. The coach said to him, or she said to me, let's be clear, she didn't say this to him. She said, I can't put kids in an event that takes them 20 or 25 minutes to finish. The meet host is going to be super angry and probably never invite us back again. And so I explained this to my youngest son in a 8-year-old friendly sort of a way. And he said, okay. And then he came up with a plan with another coach to basically prove that he could do it. So they came up with a plan. His immediate coach, kind of umbrella coach, is the one who declined it without getting into all the swim details. So anyway, the coach, his immediate coach, and he come up with a plan that he's going to swim it in practice, and the entire group of swimmers that are going to swim it in practice, and he's going to prove to the other coach that he can do this, so he can get into the swim meet. And so anyway, the coach dedicates this night to all of these kids swimming this 500 in practice. And the coach who decides, I'll just say it that way, the coach who decides wouldn't give him a time. She wouldn't say, if you do it in less than this amount of time, I'll let you register for the event. She just said, I want to know what your time is. And so he has no target, right? And so he just does his very best. He does his very best without worrying about failing, without even thinking about failing. He does his very best, and he finishes this practice in 11 minutes. The coach thought it would take him 20 minutes or more. So she proves to her, that the deciding coach, that he can do this, and she lets him register for this event at the meet. He goes to the meet. He's swimming with kids who are 10 years old, 12 years old, doesn't matter. He finishes a couple of minutes after the last one had finished ahead of him, and he finishes in 10 minutes. So he takes off a minute from his normal time in practice and sets this team record. Why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because what drove him here, and what I see in so many consultants who are successful, is that he was willing to do what others were not willing to do. In 25 years, it didn't even dawn on all these kids who have come through this program in 25 years. They either were unwilling to swim this race or didn't even cross their mind that it was a possibility. And that's what I want to share with you here today, is this example from this 8-year-old to illustrate for you that one of the things that is so important and such an ingredient for you to be successful as a consulting business owner is that you're willing to try things, that you're willing to do things that others are not willing to do, that you're willing to do things that others may not have even considered trying. This for you, and the question that I have for you today around this particular example of what are you willing to do to be successful is to ask yourself, what am I willing to try that others might not have even thought of? What am I willing to try that others aren't willing to do? We oftentimes get so wrapped up and worrying about what's going to damage our reputation that we end up not trying anything that is kind of in the realm of not highly likely to be successful. And we end up playing so small. And oftentimes, this worry about damaging our reputation, I'll give you an example. Oftentimes, I hear from consultants who tell me, I really need to dial in my marketing. I really need this one pager. I really need this, my talk track before I go out and start networking. And I'm up for a little bit of that. Let's not just go fly by the seat of our pants and look unprepared. But at the same time, when you're spending weeks and weeks and weeks on this thing, and months even on this thing, and I've seen consultants spending years on this thing, whatever it is to be feeling like you're ready to go have those conversations, that is such an indicator that you are not willing to try. You are not willing to try to have conversations that might be a little bit awkward, that might not be fully baked yet. And you're so worried about your reputation that at the end of the day, you have no reputation at all because you're not willing to go out there and experiment and try and refine and even see what the results could be for you. So that's the first question that I have for you. That's the first concept that I have for you about what are you willing to do to be successful. Now, obviously, you are not an 8-year-old swimmer, but hopefully that example gives you an interesting way to think about this. Especially now, I hear so often, I'm so worried about the how many consultants are out there right now, and there seem to be more and more at it, trying this out every week, every day. Ask yourself, what are you willing to try that others are not going to be willing to try? What are you willing to do that others are not willing to do to make yourself stand out? Okay, that was the inspiration of today's episode. Now we're going to move into two more questions and concepts around this willingness, and they are consulting specific. No more swim examples. They are consulting specific examples. So the next question is, what are you willing to do in order to be successful in your consulting business? So this is similar to the example I just gave you, slightly different. When I started out in consulting, it evolved from that was 11 years ago now, 11 and a half maybe. When I started out, I was doing a lot of consulting, helping companies scale. And then it turned into a lot of executives pulling me aside and saying, I really need to talk this through, or I need some help. And so it became much more advisory in nature and ultimately coaching in nature. That was the beginnings of my coaching. And I got certified and started really purposefully working on landing executive coaching engagements with companies, right? So I would start selling my executive coaching to in the same model, right? B2B that you're in. And so whether you're an executive coach or not, is this also applies to advisory type work and general consulting type work, but just to give you a little bit of a context here. And so I started out and I started having conversations with people in my network, with people I was meeting on LinkedIn, just as many conversations as possible. At the same time, I had other colleagues who had gone through the coaching certification with me and were also working on creating corporate coaching practices. And I noticed that they were really struggling. They were struggling to land clients. They were kind of spinning around and not making a whole lot of progress. And I started making a lot of progress. At first, it looked like just meeting after meeting after meeting, meeting people, talking with them, trying to understand what they needed or what opportunities might be available. And there was such a mismatch in those conversations. We would get on a call that sometimes I thought was a networking call and they thought it was a sales call. Sometimes I thought it was a sales call and they thought it was a networking call. It was just very messy. It was very messy, but I met so many amazing people. And when I first started out, I think my close rate was at 1% or maybe 3%. It was incredibly, incredibly low. My success rate was very, very low, but I was willing to keep going. I was willing to keep working at this to improve. And over time, I just look back at my metrics from that time period, 5 or 6 years ago. And over that time period, in a couple of years, I had 1,000 conversations, over 1,000 conversations. And my focus at the time, what I was willing to do was to be bad. I was willing to be bad. I was willing to take this and improve one step at a time. And so, one step at a time, I started off by improving my lead quality. How do I improve the way that I'm creating these leads and these conversations so that my close rate goes up? And it did from 1%. Let's hope it goes up because there was really nowhere else to go. Then I started getting better at improving and creating a mix of inbound and outbound type leads. And then after I mastered that or improved that, I started figuring out how to get better at a sales discovery conversation. And then I started focusing on how to get better at the proposal. I took it step by step by step to improve little by little by little. And along the way, I was being willing to be really bad at business development, at lead generation, at marketing, at selling, at closing new client engagements for this executive coaching program that I had. And then eventually, little by little by little, when I took it down to each step, mastering each step, I ended up getting to the place where I was at 100% close rate for that executive coaching. Just to be clear, for that executive coaching. And then I realized, okay, now I'm underselling myself. 100% close rate is, we've talked about this on the podcast before, is not a good thing. It means that you're likely undercharging. And so I changed my pricing. And then the close rate went down probably to 50 or 60%. And then I set a goal of how do I get better at selling at this price point? And I moved it back up to around 80%, which is a really good target to have. And so the concept here is, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to be bad at? What are you willing to do to continuously iterate and improve until you get where you want to be? And that is another ingredient of success into your consulting business. And you might be saying, if you've listened to this podcast before, I call it the but Melisa. But Melisa, my business is different. It's a lower volume. I'm not selling executive coaching to corporate clients. I'm selling 3 or 4 engagements a year. If I go at it this way, I could ruin my reputation, just like we were talking about a minute ago. So what I'm going to say to you in response to this, if you're thinking, oh, my business is slightly different, I can't test all of this out the way you just described. What I'm going to say to you in response to that is, yes, you are correct. Your business might be different. You might be lower volume. You might not be selling executive coaching or less complex offerings. You might be selling something that takes a longer sales cycle and not as many leads to create the results that you're looking for. Of course, that could be very true. What I will also say is, ask yourself, how does what I just shared with you apply to you? Even though your business model is slightly different, the question is not, how is my business different and how is this thing that Melissa's saying to me irrelevant? No, the question is, what are you willing to try? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to be bad at until you figure it out and then put yourself on the path to being successful? What are you willing to try? What are you willing to be bad at? That's what the question is. And how do you set yourself up for that? It might look like, you know what, I'm going to go sell a lot more smaller type things to begin with so I can have more leads and more at bats and sell more, maybe some strategy type sessions or 2-day road mapping, facilitation. Ask yourself, where are the gaps in your business right now? Is it lead generation? Is it your ability to close new deals? Is it your ability to take a conversation and turn it into an opportunity? Wherever that is, find that sticking point, that number one sticking point for you right now. Of course, you could improve a lot of areas, but what's the number one sticking area right now? And then ask yourself, what am I willing to try so that I can get better at this and ultimately be successful? So that's the second example, the second type of willingness. First, we had, what are you willing to try? And then we had, what are you willing to be bad at? And the third one is, what are you willing to think about yourself? What are you willing to think about yourself in order to be successful? That might sound very weird. And it kind of does on the surface, but let me tell you an example to bring this to life. What are you willing to think about yourself? I had a consultant client who came to me and said, I'm so good at execution. I'm really good at execution. I'm so good at understanding a certain strategy that a corporate client has and bringing that strategy to life. I don't see myself so much as someone who's really good at visioning and strategy and the bigger picture. I'm really, really good at execution. And not just, me executing. She said, I'm really good at organizing other people to execute as well. I'm really bringing a whole team together to get something that typically has been, failed in the past to make it successful. That's how she described herself to me. The problem with that she presented to me was that she had hit a ceiling. She was tired of doing the types of projects where she kind of ended up getting relegated. She would start off as more of a true consultant and doing more advisories and execution. And then over time, she would be relegated to, a more seasoned senior strategic type project manager. She was frustrated with this. She didn't want to do those types of projects anymore. She wasn't feeling fulfilled. And her pricing had hit a ceiling as a result of this as well. And so oftentimes when we hit this type of situation in our business, which is very common, we think the fix is, well, I better go fix my niche, or I better go work on my ideal client profile, or I better, re-engineer my offerings. And those things can be important. But the first thing that is the prerequisite to all of that, in order to be successful, especially if you've hit a ceiling of some sort in your business, is to ask yourself, how are you thinking about yourself? How are you willing to think about yourself differently? For this particular consultant, she was thinking about herself, as kind of a project manager, program manager who was incredibly good at it. She was thinking of herself as someone, the way we talked, kind of peeled back the onion, we realized she was thinking about herself as someone who sits in the wall of a boardroom. So you've got a boardroom and executives are meeting, and she was thinking of herself as a support person who sits, is really good at what she does, but is sitting there to hear the context kind of in the back of the room rather than having a seat at the table. She was fully capable and is fully capable of having a seat at that table based on her, 15 years, 20 years of experience. But she saw herself, she thought of herself as someone who sits in the back of the room or against the wall, not at the board table, at the main table. So the fix here is, with respect to the ceiling that she had hit, was that she needed to be willing to think of herself differently in order to achieve a new level of success. And this sounds incredibly simple, and it is, but it also can be very, very scary and create a lot of resistance around this because we're used to thinking about ourselves in a certain way. Whatever the label is that you want to use for this scenario, for this example, she was thinking of herself as this kind of robust hybrid project program manager. And it's scary to start thinking about yourself in a different way. For her, she had to start thinking about herself as a peer to those executives who were at the table, an advisor to those executives who are at the table. And this really touches on this imposter syndrome concept. We could put the link in the show notes. That was a few episodes ago. But the reason why this is so simple, what are you willing to do to be successful? How are you willing to think about yourself to be successful is so simple, but it's also very scary because we have as a human, a fear of rejection, a fear of failure, a fear of being outed as an imposter in some way. And so for you, and I'll share with you what we did for her first, and then I'll tell you how to apply this to you. For her, what we did was we didn't work first on adjusting her offerings or adjusting her marketing and positioning. What we worked on first is her identity, how she saw herself, to start shifting into, and this isn't like a mantra, where she's just sort of repeating things in the mirror every day. This is a true way of thinking and way of being for her that had to shift, that she saw herself genuinely as someone who has a seat at the table, as someone whose perspective is valuable, as someone who is strategic and has in the past been good at executing and operating as well. That her thought process about herself doesn't lead anymore with I'm amazing at project management and program management and implementing and executing, and I can do strategy too. It was flipping that. I'm incredible as the way she thought shifted into thinking of herself was I'm really good at strategy. I'm really good at figuring out the big picture. And I'm also really good at helping to operationalize that. Do you see the difference? One is leading and the other one is following. And it's a reflection of that self-identity. And so that's the work that had to be a precursor to any shift in strategy or details of her type of offering or what type of client she was wanting to build her pipeline around. She ended up gaining those strategy engagements, those advisory retainer type engagements, shifting the nature of her pipeline primarily from that shift in how she saw herself and therefore how she was portraying herself and ultimately setting it up so other people could see her differently, so that those potential clients could see her differently. And so the question for you as we think about this third version of what are you willing to do to be successful? What are you willing to think about yourself? How are you willing to think about yourself differently in order to get different results? And it takes some courage, my friend. It takes some courage to start thinking about yourself as someone who's more strategic, who's more powerful, who's more successful, who's more has the results that you want. It takes some bravery to do that. But it's so important to think of yourself in that way ahead of time in order to get what you want, in order to show up in the way that you are that successful person who walks into a boardroom and commands attention because of the way that you're carrying yourself and the way you're thinking of yourself and the permission that you're giving yourself to show up in the way that you're showing up. So this is so important. How are you willing to think about yourself in order to achieve the level of success that you're wanting to achieve? So to pull all of this together, we started off with an 8-year-old swim meet, which was the inspiration. But to pull it all together, I've given you several examples today of what are you willing to do? What are you willing to try? How are you willing to think? What are you willing to commit to in order to be successful, in order to really showcase your expertise and be willing to commit to something no matter what until it works? So I'll leave you today with these 5 questions that I want to encourage you to sit down and answer for yourself. And we'll put these in the show notes as well so that you can just click on the link here in the podcast player. It'll take you to the show notes, and then you can just copy and paste these 5 questions. What are you willing to risk to have the business you want? What are you willing to try or experiment with in order to have the business you want? What are you willing to do to have the business you want? What are you willing to feel to have the business you want? We didn't go into a lot of detail around this question today in today's episode, so I want to spend a little moment here. What are you willing to feel to have the business you want? To have the business you want, you need to be willing to feel discouraged. You need to be able to feel frustrated. and willing to feel inadequate. You need to be willing to feel all of those, what we would categorize as negative emotions. Because if you're trying to avoid those, you're again playing small. What are you willing to feel to have the business you want? I have an episode, a fairly early on episode about this topic. So we'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. But what are you willing to feel to have the business you want? And finally, the fifth and last question here to help you put this episode into action is, how are you willing to think about yourself to have the business you want? Being successful comes down to so much, if we just were to summarize it, your willingness. And so today, I highly encourage you to think about, where is your willingness and how can you adjust it in order to get where you want to go? And the last thing I'll say before we wrap up today is, if you want help with this, this is partially what I do with my independent consulting coaching clients. This is the type of work we do on our coaching calls, in addition to strategy and tactics. So if this is something that this is what you need in order to break into the next level of success in your consulting business, let's just have a conversation. You can book a time at consultmelisa.com. My name is missing an S, so it's Melisa, consultmelisa.com. Let's have a conversation and see where you're at, and if coaching would be a good fit for you to help you move past where you are right now and toward the vision you have in your business. All right. Thank you for tuning in, and I'm excited to see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissalieberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.